on a budget anyway.
Yeah. Oh, good. We've got to bring him around here. This is an interview with James Stansbury.
Yeah.
Pronounce it correctly. The date is December the 10th, 1993, and it's in Toronto, Ontario. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Linda.
Thanks very much for taking time to come and talk with me today. I hope that you'll enjoy yourself more than anything else. I hope you won't feel stressed. Could you please tell me where you were born?
I was born in Newark, New Jersey. There were no riots going on at the time, though.
Oh, good. And I'll ask you the date of the
It was in 1942,
Okay, and your actual birthday?
January 23rd.
Oh, happy birthday! It's pretty soon.
It's coming, yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if we could maybe begin in a chronological way. Perhaps you could tell me a little bit about your education. You have a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture degree. Could you tell me where you studied and,
Yes.
and when?
I went to the formal name actually is a state university in New York. At the time, it was the College of Forestry. Everyone refers to it as Syracuse because it's on the Syracuse University campus in Syracuse, New York. And it's now changed its name. I believe it's now the College of Environmental Sciences. And it had a pretty significant undergraduate program in landscape architecture. But I didn't go there with landscape architecture in mind. I was one of those great, part of that great mass of people, I think, who really didn't know what they wanted to do. And I ended up with an idea of wanting to do something that was sort of driven by natural resources and outdoor kind of, if not life, then focused in terms of work. And it was only after the first year there, which was general for everybody, that I realized that there was such a thing as landscape architecture at that school. And so I kind of came in the back door in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Who were some of the people that you studied with?
Well, let's see. We are you talking on the faculty?
Yes.
Or yeah, the faculty. Brad Sears was probably the stalwart of the school in terms of influencing me. He taught all aspects of the profession, but he concentrated on highway planning and design and construction and so on. Hank Williams, was not a landscape architect, but he was on the faculty and he taught planning policy, and he had intriguing ways of teaching that I think also had quite an influence on me. He left the school and ended up in the state government in a fairly high position in policy development and so on environmental conservation matters. Bob Ryman was sort of the new man on the block, so to speak. Back then, he taught design, and the department did need sort of a lot of infusion of new thinking, and he brought it to the faculty. George Earle was a wonderful professor of art and art history. Fascinating character. We all loved him. He lived the way we all wanted to live, out on a mountaintop with a ski hill coming right to the top where his house was, and a rope tow, and we used to have great parties at his house.
That's a good part.
Yeah.
When you said Hank Williams influenced you, what do you mean by that? What was?
Well, Hank Williams had a way of teaching that had a real impact on me. He loved to.
Sorry for the interruption.
He had a style of teaching where he tried to teach a lot through people debating major issues of the day. But he didn't do it in the normal way. He found out what side of a particular issue a student was on, paired him up with someone else, and made him speak with the other side. And that meant you had to really research a lot more. You couldn't just loaf on the basis of what you already knew. You had to find out why the other point of view perhaps had some validity because you were going to defend it. So a topic like whether there should be wilderness set aside in massive amounts from the public land base in the U.S., I was all for that, but I had to argue against it, and it made me learn. It made me learn a lot of things. There was one other professor too. Let me just think here for a minute. Wow, it's got to come. I'll have to come back and give you the name. He was an older gentleman, and he taught one course, which was architectural history. But he had another innovative way of teaching that we hated at the time, and I didn't really appreciate it till much later in life. He would give us a 1-hour lecture at 11 in the morning. So at noon it was over, but just before the bell would ring, he would hand out an assignment, which was due at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, same day. And we would go back, and it was a studio assignment. We'd go back into the studio after lunch. We weren't really allowed to skip lunch or anything. It couldn't start till 1 o'clock. We had 3 hours to design something. And of course, everything else we were doing was month-long projects, team projects, semester-long group things. And he taught us to think fast and try to cover all the bases and try to come up with the germ of some innovative approach to a problem. And we hated it, as you can imagine, because it was an enormous strain. But he told us how to compress thought and get it down on paper, too. You had to hand in a drawing. It had to be a finished drawing. And he was ruthless about leaving a title block off or a scale off. Or, so we thought this is really picky stuff. But it was a discipline he was trying to impose on us. He really didn't care about the title block. He cared about us delivering everything we were supposed to deliver. And I think that was pretty important.
And I think so often in professional schools like that, the one thing that you don't ever learn in school is how to be professional. And this sounds like that's exactly what he was trying to teach you. That if you're going to be professional, when you present a drawing, there is a title block on it.
Yes.
It doesn't ever go to the client without one. So in retrospect, I should say, you really learned a lot from that. And I think when someone tells you, you have to design this in 3 hours, that's probably a lot of time in terms of conceptualizing it, because what it makes you do is get to the essence of what your design is about. And that's the critical part anyway, isn't it?
That's right.
After the 3 hours passes, the rest of that time is generally spent on presentation or redoing something that you probably shouldn't redo.
That's right.
But in the 3 hours, you really can come up with the concept that you need to. As you say, though, when you're a student, you don't appreciate that, do you?
No, and we resisted initially. We complained, we whined, we did anything but good work until about halfway through the semester, and suddenly we started performing, really well, and not approaching it with the same anxiety at all, but accepting it as a tremendous challenge. And trying to do not just anything in the 3 hours, but something terrific. So by the end of the course, we still hated it because you were really stressed out by the end of the afternoon. It was unlike anything else we were doing. Everything else was studying in the dorm, all night, sessions in the studio and so on. With him, it was done at 4 o'clock and you went home. And it was a relief, but there was a lot of pressure there. And I think it taught me things that are with me today. I think those kinds of teaching methods way back in 1960s, early 60s, were probably unusual for the time. I don't know.
And then when you got your undergraduate degree, that was 1964.
Mm-hmm.
And you practiced as a landscape architect directly, or?
Yeah, I should say I started practicing my profession in the most basic way the year before I graduated, because we were required to have a summer job that was related to our profession. They were not all that easy to find, and they hardly paid what we needed to make our way through school, but it was a requirement. And I went to work for the U.S. the National Park Service in the U.S., and I was stationed in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, where I did all my work on Skyline Drive, and it's a segment that just continues on for 400 more miles or so as the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is more familiar to people. But I enjoyed that, but I saw the distinction of a highly centralized design organization, the Park Service, which had all of its design staff stationed in either Philadelphia or I think it was Denver or maybe San Francisco. All the design was done there by people who rarely had a chance to go and see the sites that they were designing for. And then people like me and the fellow I reported to were landscape architects in the field. We had to supervise the construction of something designed by somebody else. And so we were frustrated because we weren't allowed to make changes. They were frustrated having designed it in the first place without having seen much of the site, and secondly, having to sign off on it just when it got interesting and construction commenced. So I said, this is the wrong way for this profession to be operating, and I don't think I want to work for the Park Service. So I was this outdoorsy oriented person and natural resource oriented person. So I, after graduation, went with the Forest Service, completely different organization. It was dealing with multiple use issues rather than single preservation, recreation oriented parks. National forests produce timber, there's logging going on, there's roads being built, there's wildlife management and all kinds of interesting things. And there's outdoor recreation and a very decentralized organization in which you really make your decisions on your own 2 feet in the field. You're thrown into a situation, as I was, where you're almost on day one having to defend your turf with foresters, wildlife biologists, engineers who are building roads the way they like to build roads. And they all want to put you in a recreation slot initially. So while you go design campgrounds, meanwhile, the rest of us are getting on with the big job. And I think I did well winning them over to some new ways of thinking, even as a new graduate. And I got immense satisfaction out of it. So I was having some influence about alignments of new roads and where wildlife habitat might be improved. And I don't want to blow it out of proportion because it was only 2 years of my initial career, but I think it was the best 2 years anybody could ever ask for, because I just wasn't sitting in an office designing. I was out on the ground arguing why things should be done certain ways, and quite often I would lay everything out on the ground and do the drawings later. You just didn't start with a piece of paper, think about what you wanted to do, make a drawing, hand it to somebody else to implement. You actually went out on the ground with a team of people, other disciplines. And I also learned what I hadn't learned at Syracuse. You would think going to a place that's called a College of Forestry, I would have been especially well prepared. And that's when I discovered some of the weaknesses in that program. I went through school surrounded by zoologists and botanists and fisheries people and all kinds of natural sciences, even something as simple as air photo interpretation. And yet in 4 years at Syracuse, I was never exposed to any of that. And I think that's true of so many of the schools. You might be surrounded by planners and architects, but you're usually at war with them rather than working with them. And you graduate and realize that there were some opportunities there that the curriculum or the faculty or whatever just didn't maximize. So I learned myself, for the most part, a lot of things that I know today, like photo interp, enough to get by, and how to talk the language of some other discipline and try to influence them.
Which is a very significant part of the practice of landscape architecture, isn't it? It's not an isolated area. It's a discipline that does work very much in harmony with lots of other disciplines.
I agree. I think there's a tendency, too, to think of landscape architecture in design terms all the time. And as youthful practitioners who are doing the same thing 30 years later that they did when they first graduated, I don't think enough people grasp the evolution of a professional, whether they're working in government or in private practice or even teaching. You don't do the same things the second 10 years that you were doing the first. You give things away to other people to do who are interested in learning at different levels than where you are now. And I think what you just said is where you really have to move toward. You have to be capable of building a consensus amongst maybe the public and a public agency, or a community and its political leaders, or architects and engineers. It doesn't matter. If all you can do is design well, I don't think you're successful in that regard.
So then, after your 2 years with the Forest Service, how come I can't hear you? After testing 1, 2, testing.
Yeah, testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
After your 2 years with the Forest Service, you then came to Canada. Is that correct?
That's right. The Forest Service is sort of like a military organization. A lot of federal agencies are. They don't want you staying in one place all your life. They have other ideas for your talents and skills than just doing what you're doing on one particular national forest. So I was always being asked to move around. Even in the first 2 years, my wife and I were given chances to live in Missouri, a couple of places in California, Washington, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and so on. There was an enormous pressure to move on and be introduced to new terrain and new problems. And I just didn't feel comfortable enough making a few of those moves and feeling locked in, having done so. I wanted to try private practice and then make up my mind. So I was happy doing what I was doing. It wasn't leaving out of a desire for something better. It was not wanting to feel that I was committed to a public service career. And so we had one child. We were still quite young. Everything we owned would fit in a small trailer. So I started looking around for private practice opportunities. And it's purely luck, whatever, that I came to Canada. The Landscape Architectural News Digest, as it does today, lists job opportunities. So back in 1966, I looked at a number of things, and I saw an ad by Michael Huff in Toronto. And my wife and I had honeymooned in Muskoka, so we knew something about Ontario. And I said, this will be a real test. If it's an interesting position, we can change countries, change environments, and change from public to private. So I came up and had an interview with Michael Huff on Colburn Street. And it was Michael. There was nobody else there. And my initial reaction was, oh my goodness, this is going to be tough. It isn't really a full-fledged practice at all. It's just really getting rolling. But he showed me something. He showed me Scarborough College, and it had such an impact on me that I said, this is the thing I should do. I should give this a try because of him. And we'd all studied McHarg. We all knew about ecosystem-based planning and more sensible development principles. But I had never seen it applied on the ground the way I saw it at Scarborough. And Michael, with a team of other disciplines, had done something I think, for our practice, it's the touchstone, it's the cornerstone of everything we've done since. Because he showed how to bring all these disciplines together and make sound planning and much that we don't want to lose. at Scarborough College, Michael brought together a lot of disciplines. He was on a team with John Andrews, who's an architect, and Michael Hugo Brunt, who is a planner. And they were given this task of designing a new community or satellite campus for the U of T, University of Toronto. They were going to have one in Scarborough and they're going to have one in Arundel. The site was fantastic. It was tablelands that slid off into this incredible valley, wooded valley, cut with streams and so on, and a majestic site. And I think the Board of Governors, taking one look at it, would have liked to have started developing in the valleys, which were so beautiful. But Michael persuaded them that the building should sit on the edge of the slope and protect the slope therever after, and that by designing that way, it could only expand out onto the tablelands in the other direction and not start damaging the environment. You know, consultants do their work and then they're gone, and all kinds of other people come along and make subsequent decisions. And so in a way, there was an arrogance to this. He was denying others the opportunity to make the wrong decisions. And I was impressed by that. And the way he, the architecture was incredibly organic and flowed along this brow with turns and so on. And the pedestrian street that flowed through the whole system was always oriented to the valley and looking out these marvelous views. And an awful lot of work had to be done to make this thing successful. There were still pipes in the ground that cut through streams and so on. And the way in which it was done with a lot of ecological advice and thought, considering that it was in the early 60s, I mean, it just couldn't help but impress me. I think it's probably one of the significant projects or works in Canada, yes. Because it took the theory of Macquarie that had tended to be applied at a fairly broad regional scale, or plan for the valleys, and brought it down to one site and one building, and demonstrated that these things work at that scale too. And so I got pretty enthusiastic about that and said yes and joined Michael. I took a cut in pay, had to pay my own expenses to come, and ended up with this transferal of lifestyle that actually was quite damaging. I should say that, because my wife and I lived in New Hampshire. We were in the White Mountains area, and that's the national forest we were working at. And I lived in the woods and had a trout stream that ran by the door and a ski hill right in front of me. And I transferred all of that, or replaced all of that with Flemington Park and Don Mills. And I was just one of the great masses who every morning we got up, opened the door into the garages of an underground parking lot from our townhouse units. And I looked, and everybody was standing there with the keys in their hand and their briefcases and their other. We all got in cars and we all followed each other like lemmings down the Don Mills Road, Don Valley Parkway, and into downtown Toronto, where we all worked. And it was too abrupt to change. So anyway, I got quite ill, but I got over all of that, and it was. I don't regret it at all. I don't regret anything I've done because I've learned some useful lessons from it.
This Scarborough College had been completed by Michael?
No, I got involved in some supervision at the tail end, but it was essentially complete by the time I arrived. And
then what was your first project, or your next one, that something that you worked on that you felt was?
Well, I picked up the tail end of Scarborough, and I picked up the tail end of Metro Toronto Courthouse, which was a nice, completely different urban design problem, flowing from University Avenue right through to Nathan Phillips Square, where the relatively new City Hall was standing. But my first project, I guess I would call my own, or one that I started initially with Michael was a little thing on the edge of the University of Toronto campus at the Royal Ontario Museum. Peter Swan was the director of the museum, and he was a real maverick in the sort of museum culture. He was always trying new things, and he wanted to move the museum out on the street to the people. And he had this idea, and that's all it was this idea. I want to take some of my exhibits, I want to put them outside on the street, and I want the people to come and see what we have to offer inside. I want to lure them in. But if they don't come in, that's all right. They'll still learn something. So we designed this parquet kind of thing, very urban. We set up diagonal squares, sort of on the diagonal to the street, a very busy street, Avenue Road right there. And this fortress-like museum that doesn't really invite you in.
Most museums don't.
No, that's right. And he had a staff that wasn't exactly committed to his ideas, and he had a board of directors who thought he was crazy to take anything of value and risk it being outside. But we had these diagonal paving squares, very large. It was a kind of modular design, and we put benches in the back corners, taking up two sides of the square. And these allowed people to face the street when they sat. But then we plopped down in front of them, between them and the street, these display cases. And they were very light glass kinds of things. We wanted the exhibits inside to be seen, not the cases. So we had to work with sort of display designers who knew about those things. And it was enormously successful because finally his staff started to see some value. And I can remember one display in particular that was dinosaur fossils. I can imagine what it'd be like today with Jurassic Park and all the kids wanting dinosaur stuff. This was way back in, still in, I think, the late 60s. They used fine fishing line that was invisible, really, to suspend bones in space, big jaw bones and things. And there was enough text to explain what this was, people were saying. And even driving by, these things would be lit at night, and you'd want to stop. So I had a lot to do with the design, and it wasn't a big project, but it's part of the fabric of Toronto. I can look back and say I did that. That's me. And with Michael, it wasn't all me by any means. But I think, as you can almost tell, there was such a contrast between what I had been doing and these kinds of things. And I had decided when I joined Michael that this was something that was going to grow. And I like doing occasional urban design projects, but it's not where I want to have my feet planted. So the practice at that time was almost entirely Toronto, almost entirely urban design, and notwithstanding Scarborough, almost entirely working with architects and engineers, and usually being on their teams and trying to influence. It's this sort of upward influencing thing that can be so negative, actually. But so I started looking for things beyond the city, and it was a while before I had some success. I started trying to convince engineers not to hire other engineers, but to hire me to do recreation planning and conservation areas and so on. And the decision makers were mostly engineers, government engineers who were in control of floodplains and conservation authorities and so on. And then eventually I got a couple of these to do, and they were reasonably successful. And then I got my first provincial park, which I wanted very much. There hadn't been too many success stories for landscape architects doing those. They were either done by planners or engineers and so on.
Which provincial park was that?
First one I did was Frontenac Provincial Park, which is in eastern Ontario, north of Kingston. And I look back and I look at the drawings and things, and I say, gee, these weren't very good. But the thought that was there, the concept, which I called threshold wilderness, was good. There was a lot of pressure to simply fulfill all of the demand for new recreation facilities that couldn't be met in the current park system in that eastern region. So we had people, marketing experts and so on, saying, well, you need 300 more campsites, you need so many more picnic sites, you need all these things because the demand is there and the government is not meeting it. And I looked at this brand new sort of 12,000 acre park, which is part of the Canadian Shield. The Frontenac axis comes all the way down just north of Kingston. Spectacular, rugged topography. And I said, no, this is something more special. This needs more care. And I thought of it as a training ground for wilderness exploration so that people could come to Frontenac and learn basic skills, backwoods sort of skills, and then move on to Quetico and Killarney and, bigger parks where they really need to know what they were doing. And I called it threshold wilderness because it really wasn't wilderness in the normal definition. It wasn't big enough. So that was one of the early things I did.
What were some of the design concepts that you incorporated in order to make the idea of threshold wilderness work?
Well, we decided that we're dealing with people who probably don't know a whole lot about wilderness recreation and so on. So we set up an idea that there would be a base of operations in terms of a small campground. There'd be a training center, not your typical visitor center where you go in and see exhibits, but a place to bring experts in and talk about canoeing skills. There was a little lake there nearby, so they could actually demonstrate techniques. And I think what we wanted to do more than just the physical skills was talk about behavior, low impact recreational use. So what do you do when your dishes are dirty and all these sorts of things? And how do you create a campsite in the middle of the wilderness that no one will know you were there after you leave? So a lot of it was in the theoretical, but it had to be translated into loop trails that would introduce people in varying degrees of difficulty and definite control on the number of people in the system at any given time. And a subsequent piece of work occurred on programming. It was quite revolutionary. It would be what everyone is doing today. It was building partnerships and alliances with the private sector because there's no government money for anything. But back then, it was fairly new, and we had worked out a system whereby, let's say Coleman, which makes all kinds of outdoor equipment, they could bring their equipment to the park, and using this center, demonstrate their equipment, give lessons on using Coleman canoes and tiny little stoves rather than the big thing, that you put on a picnic table. We're talking about lightweight backwoods recreation where everything you got you're carrying and you don't want it to weigh very much. So they could demonstrate their equipment, get their brand name in front of people, but have a whole class there programming, program to come in on a certain weekend or whatever, and then school groups and all the rest.
And did they provide funding?
Well, they actually provided equipment and staff expertise, and there was really nothing else needed. People just signed up and they paid for the course, but the Ministry of Natural Resources was able to keep most of that. So that was successful.
What was your was there any kind of a basis for that from your work in the United States? Had something like that been done that you were?
No, but I'd certainly been exposed to wilderness travel in the White Mountains. Enormous trail system. Probably one of the most unique things about that part of New England is a couple of thousand miles of hiking trails, all varying degrees of difficulty. One of the things that I had to do when I first arrived in my job in New Hampshire was do a map showing all the fatalities over the history of the National Forest. So I had to do a map plotting a fatality and a date and a reason, a cause of death. And it was, most often, it was not falls from mountain climbing, but exposure. And it taught me just how many people die doing some of these things. So there was something to carry forward into the Frontenac. I mean, the conditions were nothing like the alpine conditions in the White Mountains, but what I was trying to do was introduce people to what those things could be like.
So and the fatalities that had happened in the White Mountains didn't happen.
Yeah, yeah, and to get real value out of getting back into some of these resources by knowing what you're doing and what to look for and learning.
Just to perhaps expand that question a little bit further, when I said what was the basis for the design of your work in relation to the wilderness experience, how did that work? And was your design concept because you were trained and educated in the United States? Do you feel that there was a design basis that was particularly American in terms of thought, or do you think that what you learned in terms of your schooling was strictly applicable in Canada?
It probably came not so much from an American point of view, but from the things I had been exposed to in Syracuse. I was given room to breathe on my own, and I had a lot of interest in wilderness as a movement, as a philosophy of outdoor recreation, and not everything being intensely developed and overused and all those sorts of things. So when I got this chance to look at a park, I availed myself of a lot of expertise in geology and forestry and wildlife and so on. Not forestry, but plants and botany and all those sorts of things, so that I knew what the resources were about and what they could handle in terms of use, and then what were the really interesting historical or special features that were there. And I don't think it's an American thing that I did there at all. I just think it made a lot of sense to me. I think another Canadian-born landscape architect who came along might have seen some of those same opportunities to do it that way. But it was important to me to do something different. So there's a certain arrogance associated with it too. I look back now on some of the things I used to do, and I was always not easy to get along with and everything, and I don't think anyone would ever describe me as an arrogant person. But some of the things I did were arrogant, and I felt good about it because I was actually convincing somebody to do something my way. And I don't do that anymore, or I try not to. I try to convince them that I should be doing things their way.
Is that called a wisdom of the year?
I think so.
Or learning the system, one or the other. Is there another project that from your work here in Canada that you would, well, certainly, I'm sure there's lots, but is there another one that you'd like to talk about?
One of the projects that I have a lot of satisfaction about is called Lake Alert, one word, and it's something I coined. I was interested in land planning as it applied to cottaging and lakes. My wife and I had honeymooned in a cottage on the edge of a rocky piece of land, and boats whizzing by and everything, and it's all very beautiful. But the more I looked at it, the more I was exposed to it by visiting the cottages of friends and clients and so on, the more I saw a complete absence of design, or a complete absence of site planning, or even master planning at a more regional scale. It just happened. Want a cottage? Here's a cottage. And a wonderful gentleman who worked for Bell Canada, but he was a cottager. He approached Michael and I, and to this day, I'm still not sure how he heard about us, but he approached us saying, we have a problem on our lake. We think it's overdeveloped. And I'm running for council as a cottager. I don't even live there, but I want to do this because I want to try to get a better handle on how we should be planning our lake. And this fellow had enormous perseverance and dedication to anything he tried. So we ended up in a meeting with a cabinet minister who was in charge of natural resources in this province, convincing him to, trying to convince him to do things in a better way. Because a lot of cottaging was in the hands of the Crown back then in Ontario. A lot of this took place on public land. And we failed. We didn't get any money from him for a study. But then we moved on to what was in the Department of Municipal Affairs. And they said, yes, we'll give you $3,000 or whatever it was for a study, because it might be applicable elsewhere. Normally, we wouldn't help any particular council. Well, we did this study on this lake, and then Michael and I were looking at water quality and fisheries and boating patterns and all the rest. And we were seeing terrible things. People were buying their lots sight unseen at the sportsman show at the Canadian National Exhibition. And the developer would, or the realtor would put up these colorful brochures, and it was all windswept pines and rock and everybody's dream. But of course, when it came time to occupy the site, it was all rock and one windswept pine and no soil. And for a lot of these people, 30 feet above water line with no place for a beach, no place even for a dock for access. And they had to build their cottages by literally hauling concrete block up a cliff with a rope. And so out of that study for Riley Lake, which was a bit of a pioneering thing for us, it was called Riley Lake Capacity Study, which was published by the government. I said, this has got to be a better way, and we can't do it studying lakes. We have to study watersheds. So I went shopping back to Ministry of Natural Resources, and I found a fellow who was involved in lands, like they have timber and lands and parks and all these sorts of wildlife. So lands was responsible for all of this cottaging development on Crown land and planning. And I convinced him to fund a study of an entire watershed. And he picked it. He said, I got a site I got an area that there's an awful lot of development there, but there are some lakes that are not yet touched. He said, I agree with your concerns. Let's see what we can do. So this is a completely unsolicited proposal. Almost impossible to do these things today. But the satisfaction I got was perceiving a problem myself, finding a sponsor to help me do something about it, or try to do something about it, and then carrying it through in a way that, well, semi-successful. It won CSLA awards. I know it won an ASLA award. Published in the U.S. like crazy. We produced a manual on how to plan a watershed for cottaging, and it was grabbed by American agencies. Wasn't grabbed by our client. And there's something typically, people would say that's typically Canadian, wouldn't they? I don't know. The sense that the Canadians plan really well, but don't implement, and then Americans implement like crazy, and they don't plan so well. And so that was the first exposure I had to doing something that could have had a lot more impact than it did. And then
although it might have, it did, by what you're saying, it didn't necessarily have impact in Canada, but elsewhere. Probably had impact in the United States.
It did. Yeah. It had impact elsewhere, and people still refer to it. They still, I had a call from a specialist in British Columbia who still thinks it's one of the state-of-the-art, not state-of-the-art, sorry, one of the only projects done in Canada dealing with capacity for anything. It happened to be cottages, and it was kind of a crude methodology there, but it led to a way in which every lake could be ranked, every piece of shoreline scanned, and you could stand back from it all, look at all the whole watershed and say, where do we want development and where do we want things left alone? there's something nice about an undeveloped lake rather than everything going to a certain percentage of development. And that's what was happening. The government had a 25% Crown Land Shoreline Reserve rule. As long as it could hold on to 25% of every lake, it didn't mind if the rest was developed. And so you got this monotony and this blot on the landscape of everything being heavily developed. So I was showing them there are good reasons to leave things alone, and in every watershed to have some places to go where you won't see a house, you won't see a building. And then there are others which have enormous capacity, and develop those. And then develop them more wisely with different forms of cottaging. And this got into some social things that are only beginning even now in the 90s to do here in Canada. The more cluster approaches to development. Rather than ribbon development all around a lake, everybody has frontage. You say, well, here are the beaches. Rather than a few exclusive people paying premium prices to be on the beach and everyone else having to walk long distances, why don't we move back from the beach, leave it alone, and put cluster, higher density development in a pocket and leave the rest of the lake alone too. So we were pushing for those kinds of approaches.
It's too bad, though, as you said, that it wasn't picked up by your client, that wasn't implemented.
Yeah, two things happened. Wasn't too many years before they went to a leasing program of Crown land rather than developing the lots themselves. And then eventually they got right out of the business entirely. But at the time we did the work, the Ontario government was the biggest developer in the province. They did more cottage development than all of private developers combined because it had this massive land base to work with, and it was a revenue producing thing, so Treasury liked it. But they did some terrible things.
And since that time, have they changed? Have they implemented some of the ideas that you...
Well, some things have happened. You can go to some private resorts, and I think you'll see some of the basic principles. The government got out of the business completely, so they don't develop cottages in Ontario anymore. There's pressure for them to do so. In this age of lack of money, anything that'll produce revenue is more attractive.
You may have missed the last sentence you said.
Okay. The government is looking for ways in which to generate revenues rather than just spend the public purse. So I don't know whether it'll ever come back, but if it does, if the government again goes back to cottage development on Crown land, then surely it's got what it needs now to do a better job of it.
Have you seen any direct work in relation to your ideas in terms of the watershed concept? Have you seen anything that's been implemented in the United States or in other places in Canada?
I see more in the U.S. than here, and I don't want to claim that it's because of what we did on Lake Alert. But I think the U.S. does a better job with design innovation on the ground, much better than here. But they're always looking at Canada for the sort of the thinking behind it, in my view. I've talked to some American consultants, and they love to get their hands on Canada's planning policies, even conservation authorities. A watershed-based system here in Ontario of planning and resource management. There's nothing quite like that anywhere in the U.S. It's unique, genuinely unique. So Ontario has something very special here. But then when you get beyond the legislation and the jurisdictional and organizational manifestations of this thing in Ontario and look at what actually happens on the ground, you find still pretty crude development of lands. And I mean, it's not that the Conservation Authority does these things, it doesn't. But once it keeps people out of the floodplains and off steep slopes and so on, the rest of it is awful. I mean, so much of our country or our rural landscape is just being carved up with stuff that's no different than 40 years ago. But you don't have to go very far in the U.S., Pennsylvania and New England, and of course further south, to be seeing much better uses of land where higher density is a trade for much more open space, and everybody has access to things that are of common value to the public. And the developers are thinking this way, and they do all right. They get more money for those individual houses. If there's a danger, it's an elitism that might come in, and it's trying to make these systems work for somebody who doesn't have a lot of money to spend on their house. And I'm convinced it can be done. But the innovation here will be something like zero, lot line development, or big hue and cry over taking houses in a subdivision and actually turning them on slightly different angles rather than the front of the house always being parallel to the curb. Well, hell, I mean, that stuff, that's not new, and it doesn't go nearly far enough compared to what you can see elsewhere. So I don't know whether it's the developer's fault, whether it's the government's fault, or whether it's the consumer's fault, because I think everything, in my view, everything starts with consumer pressure, and I don't see it out there for better things, because I don't think they have enough exposure to how much better things could be. We don't have enough good examples of things that would create the demand, so that the people providing these things would have no choice but to start responding to what the public wants, and realizing there's money to be made. It's not all going green just in an altruistic sense. It makes economic sense.
Do you think that the reason that the Canadian consumer doesn't have those visual opportunities is because landscape architects in Canada have not done their job?
I think that's partly true. Absolutely. Yeah. I think a lot of landscape architects working for developers have a good thing going. I mean, if you do well for a developer, they'll stick with you. And I think the amount of change that is so incremental, though. I mean, how many times can you design a fence or a deck system or landscaping at the corner of a main arterial and an entrance, road into a subdivision? We have all these rules now in Canada, and certainly in Ontario and in places like Mississauga. We have very tight site planning controls over all of these things. But I don't think they produce innovation. I think they stifle it. And I would love to do a whole subdivision for somebody, but I don't think I can convince a client out there right now to take the chance. We had a client. I should go back to a project. It was called Limberlost. And it came out of those studies of lake development and so on that we had done. There was a major corporation that was in the business of doing normal housing, acquired a marvelous, it's about 2,000 or more acre property near Huntsville, Ontario. And they had whole lakes captured in their ownership. And it was the site of a historic inn, Limberlost Lodge. Wonderful old place, but past its time. No one really could make a business out of it anymore. It was for the old days when people went to Huntsville by rail from Toronto, and then in a carriage, got pulled into this lodge. We were recommended to them by the government because of the work we had done elsewhere, that if they wanted to have major development here, they should do it right. And we were mentioned to them as a firm that might do it right, because whatever they do, they were warned not to go to a surveyor who would just lay out frontage lots all around the lakes and say, well, this is what you can do. So they took the chance with us. And we did, I think we started in 1971. And within a year and a half, we had a concept that was very responsive to the resources that they had. what every lake edge was like, what every slope was like, all the soil depths, everything. We had everything in the traditional landscape architectural site analysis sense. We had all those maps. And we came down to the areas which were good for development in our view and the areas that should be left alone. And then we hired Jerome Marks and a really good, more urban-oriented architect to develop cluster housing designs that were going to fit into these few pockets that we felt were appropriate for development, but they were going to be fairly dense development. Not high-rise apartments, but more a townhouse kind of approach. In the woods, though, always in the woods. And then having access to really remote wilderness and outdoor recreation, a small ski hill, a wonderful beach, tremendous trail systems. We thought, wouldn't it be nice to have something like that and spend your day out in very rugged surroundings and then come back to something very plush? I mean, you'd pay for that. And knowing the whole place was being managed properly with an environmental sort of context. So a year and a half later, we knew what we wanted to do, and the client bought it. And it took until 1979 or 80 to get the final approval on it. And in that period of time, we went through Environmental Hearing Board, we went through Ontario Municipal Board, we went through Cabinet Appeal, by all kinds of people who thought this was wrong, and who probably wouldn't have opposed us if it had been a surveyor who laid out ribbon development, which is what everybody's used to up there. This was so different. This had sewage treatment plant, didn't have tile fields or septic tanks. It had virtually no phosphorus or nutrient enrichment going into the lakes, all approved by the Ministry of the Environment. But it took almost 10 years. And by that time, interest rates were in the low 20s. And he dropped it. I mean, the client said, I can't do this now. I have all these approvals. I fought all these battles. I've won every single skirmishing battle. And now I can't do it. And they abandoned it. And I felt really badly because we had encouraged them to be innovative, and they had done it, and they were paying a terrible price for it because the approvals took so much longer because it was different. So I can't look that developer in the face today and say, do it my way and you'll come out a winner. In the background, I know they may lose because it'll take so much longer.
How often do those kinds of economic realities and political realities affect your choice of design? Or now, anyway?
Well, they certainly affect the way we practice, but I don't think they ever affect the way we design. I think a sound landscape architect, a good landscape architect, has got to have ecology and economics closely woven in the thinking. If it's all one or the other, you get the wrong result. If it's all driven by economics, then you're probably going to have a saturation of site or resources. You're going to start doing things that you really shouldn't do. If it's all ecologically driven, as if your client's a Sierra Club, you're not going to do anything. You're going to win over a lot of people who were won over the day they came in the room. What you need to do is convince industry that there's a blend out there that's possible that will sell, that will produce profits, and leave the land in a better condition than if they did it the usual way. And so it's rare that I don't consider economics. I guess Frontenac Park was a case where I sort of thumbed my nose at economics because there was a demand for things that would have made some money for the government. But in that case, I felt that government would be making a terrible mistake, just turning it into another provincial park like all the others with lots of campground. Well, so I think, I can't say I'm true to this sort of blend all the time, but there were elements in Frontenac that went to private corporations and got assistance without going to the government purse. So there was some economy in how we were doing things.
When you deal with situations like you've just described, where it can take 10 years or so for the approval process. I wonder how landscape architecture can influence people, can change the face of Canada. And when you have these ideas, very innovative ideas, things that could work, that could certainly improve the development, and then when things like that don't go ahead, it kind of do you find that really demoralizing?
Yeah, that was, to me, that's the biggest frustration in my career, because I think that project, if it had been the normal 10 or 12% interest rates, would have been an enormous success. I can't prove it to anybody, but I think it would have, and I think it would have led to even better things. It would have had a ripple effect throughout the province. And now you can go to Huntsville nearby. You can go to Deerhurst and so on, and you'll see some of the same principles applied. But I think that was the jewel that would have shown the way, where there was a complete integration of the land and the infrastructure systems and design, all those good things. I get frustrated with what I perceived still to be this sense that landscape architecture is an interest group, just another interest group. I see it in the profession, but I see it in the students. I teach. I don't teach full time, but I do some teaching. And I've just finished a semester at Guelph with Cecilia Payne. And it's a fourth-year design studio. And I will give the students a problem statement that is involving a real place. And I know what the client is after. And it's a combination of environmental protection and enhancement, economic stimulation for a lot of people living in that particular community who are desperate for something better than they have. Kind of a dying downtown and things you see all over Canada. Some really important recreation needs for the people living there, and so on. And by the time it comes out the other end, after 4 weeks of study and so on, and I have students giving me a report restating goals and objectives and all the rest, there's only there's a too small percentage of the class that has remembered the economic. They've all gotten on the environmental or the recreation side of things. And it's as if there's something wrong about an economic objective. So when you have students who resist that kind of goal, and as you say, reality, and then they go on, then I think it's pretty dangerous. And I see it sometimes in other courses, other designs. You know, people they'll be told that they have to try to site 100 houses on this area, and there are ways in which that can be done very well. 200 would be too many, but they'll come back and say, "Well, we thought 10." And you know, if you had a developer sitting on the jury, two things would happen. The developer would, of course, climb all over them in terms of their lack of understanding of things, but the developer would also lose confidence in the profession. And until we can have the developers in the room on the juries and not just other landscape architects brought in, then I think there's something lost in that learning process. It's very real, and somehow I want to preserve the academic freedom that universities are supposed to provide to students. Let them forget some of the rules, but not the reality. Yeah.
Just on that topic, you have taught at Guelph. I think you've also taught at the University of Toronto from time to time. And I wonder what those schools can offer. You yourself were educated in the United States. There are a number of landscape architects in Canada who were. But do you feel that there's something that the schools at Guelph and Toronto, just for instance, because you talked about, that they can offer the profession of landscape architecture in Canada that cannot be offered, for instance, in the United States?
Well, it's always a balancing and a trade-off. I think if they were, I think the students in Canada that I've encountered in the programs in Canada, there's a lot of hard work and tight deadlines and all the rest of it, but there's a sort of I don't know what to call it. It's not really lackadaisical, but it's not as energized. And I have to be careful here of these sweeping generalities. But my sense of the students that I've been dealing with, there's a handful of them that are really on the move somewhere, and they want to accomplish some things. But I don't think that they get the same intensity that they would if they were in an urban, a university, surrounded by problems like ghettos and societal problems and high crime and all the things that you have to contend with in design in certain parts of the state. So there's a certain complacency that occurs, I think, that carries over into the academic world about how things are pretty good in Canada. And so I think that's a flaw. I think that one of the benefits, though, is the sense of tolerance and, in fact, awareness of other cultures. I think that's one of the strengths of Canadian schools and teaching. There's a lot more to the world than America, North America even. And I'm impressed by that part of Canadian understanding of things, the views of things. And I think it comes from what we love to call multiculturalism here at home, but and certainly bilingualism and all the rest. And I mean, some Canadians hate it and resent it, and others see it as a strength of the country. But going beyond that, I think there's much more awareness of forms of government that aren't necessarily democratic, that still work, and a completely different perception of Asian cultures, European cultures, and so on, as it might offer some answers. So that part of Canadian universities, to me, is very helpful. So that's one of the things that I think is a little more uniquely Canadian in society itself, and that gets fed into the schools. I mean, I think too that there's at least the potential for a stronger sense of broader landscape issues in Canada. I think that it's the nature of a small population in a big place. And it can be a weakness. I can remember a conversation I had with a planner in one of these government agencies in Ontario. It's probably well over 25 years ago that I had this conversation. And we were talking about land use and so on. And he was from Britain. He said, I don't know why you're so worried about capacity and using land right. He said, until I came to Canada recently, I had to work in the most confining, tight spaces. Everything we did, narrow streets, small parks, dense housing, a history of that in England. And he said, I come to Canada and I see these wide open spaces and I can hardly wait to start. And I said, yeah, but what are you going to do with it? It's going to be like being given too much candy. As a child, you're going to spoil yourself and you're going to ruin things. And I think we had a lot of that in Canada. We didn't have our own educational programs, and we didn't have Canadians in charge of things. We had imports, just like the football teams. We had imports. And those imports brought their values that weren't particularly right for Canada. I'm an import myself, but I try to see Canada as incredible in its potential and its opportunities, and surely we're not going to just repeat history and start gobbling up the land, and but it is happening. You don't have to drive very far from this hotel. Pick any direction. If you go toward Pickering, or if you go toward Brampton, or if you go toward Hamilton, you're going to see subdivisions that are no better today than they were a long time ago. There's some good things, but it's still suburban sprawl, and there's still a sense that there's lots of land out there. We seem to get excited about or worried about agricultural soil loss in cycles. Right now, nobody's talking about it. They were 10 years ago, and 10 years from now, they'll talk about it again. In the meantime, nothing happened.
And a lot of mistakes, as you say, can be repeated. Just continuing on in that topic, what do you think is particularly Canadian about Canadian landscape architecture?
Well, as a practitioner, I think the ability to practice in a much larger geographical sphere of influence is pretty different. If I were practicing in the U.S., I think I would have less likelihood of practicing in the state of Washington while basing my firm in, Maryland or something. Some firms do that. I'm not saying they don't, but the mainstream of practice in the U.S., as I perceive it, for a firm of our size, would be, a very much smaller area of work, but a huge market within that small area, because that's the nature of the U.S. But you wouldn't be doing what we do, where we might be doing something in Stanley Park and then trying to do something in the Maritime, and then the National Capital, and then back into Ontario, and then in Northern Ontario, which is another world, completely different world than what we see out this window. That, to me, it's that scope, that range of opportunity that is the most unique thing. It is not differences in design. I think it's the opportunity to apply what you know about design and site planning and all those things in an incredible, rich environment.
But if those kinds of things, site planning and design, have been learned in Canada or in the United States, does that not impact what you would eventually do?
I don't think so. I think, and I'm speaking as somebody who used to have to hire nothing but U.S. landscape architects. And the good ones knew how to adapt to new things, just as the new Canadian graduates that we hire now. They're good if they can think and learn and adapt to different cultural situations and not just different sites, but different people and different values and so on. And I don't think you can take that. You can say, I have an easier time describing a bad landscape architect and a good landscape architect than I do describing a Canadian one versus an American one. And I don't know whether I have a blind spot, because I've come years ago from the States, and that's affecting my judgment in these things, but I really don't see the difference in the profession itself in terms of the design philosophy or any particular tools in the toolkit that would say a Canadian's got something that an American doesn't have, or vice versa. I really don't. I think it's more views of the world and those kinds of things that would make some differentiation. Faculty of Canadian University probably hate me for saying that, but I'd like to know what those differences really are. If somebody wants to put them on the table, I'd like to know what they are and how they manifest themselves on the ground someplace.
And just kind of going back what you said too a minute ago, that what is Canadian about Canadian landscape architecture to you is that this opportunity of being able to work in a variety of regions. What about a landscape architect who works in Saskatchewan and only in Saskatchewan? How do you see that?
Well, I think there's something unfortunate about that. There aren't that many of us around, and I wish everyone had the opportunity to practice in other provinces and so on. And we used to do more than we do now because the economy is driving people toward buy local, and there's a lot of things out there in the marketplace now that don't let us do some of the things we used to do. And we ourselves are much more oriented to working with a local firm when we do go out of province than we used to, which I think is great. I think there's a lot of interchange, and you learn from those people, and they can learn something from you, and it's good for the profession when that happens.
What do you learn from them? What do you learn at that local level?
I really try to learn about the values that people have about land and landscape, and I'll give you an example. It's not so much what I learned from another landscape architect in Saskatchewan, but it's what I learned about, let's say, designing a campground. If you come east and look at how an Ontarian camps, they're almost always looking for the solitary experience. And if they want to have a social experience, they want to do it on the beach or somewhere, but not at the campsite. They want room between themselves and the next campsite and their neighbor. They grow up in the city. They spend all the rest of the year cheek by jowl, either in traffic or in a subdivision or even in an apartment building downtown Toronto. So when they go camping, it's got to be a contrasting kind of environment. Well, I've interviewed campers in Saskatchewan who are wanting the shared experience, not the solitary. And they think you're crazy if you want to separate them from their neighbor. And they have come not necessarily from Saskatoon or Regina, but from farms, where their neighbors are 2 miles away anyway. So they get together is what it's all about. And they'll even register year after year the same set of campsites so they know who all their neighbors will be, even if they never see them any other time of the year. It's not necessarily their buddies. It's just that so-and-so, who's coming from Moose Jaw, we always see them at the campsite the last 2 weeks of August, and we're going to see them this year. And so the design has to reflect that. If all you do is go out there and try to impose what works well in Ontario on that landscape, no one's going to use it. And they're going to think you're crazy and arrogant, and in the end insulting to them, because you haven't stopped to think about what they really want.
So it's sensitivity to the
Sensitivity.
local needs and materials.
And recognize that it's not always subtle. It's really different, some of this stuff. So I think a landscape architect practicing in Saskatchewan probably could have informed us of some of these things if they had experience with it. I always try to get to the people themselves, but of course people think about plant materials and whether you can buy this kind of brick out here, and I'm trying to talk at a different level than that. The ideas and the concepts being shared.
Kind of taking that into consideration, what do you feel are possible directions, or not even necessarily directions? What do you feel there is for the future of landscape architecture in Canada?
Wow, on a personal basis, and I don't know that this will be the case for the core of the profession, but I think we have to have a body of professionals out there who are not site-oriented, who are not project-oriented in terms of traditional site planning and design. That will always be the core of our practice or of our profession. But for me, it's how we operate on the fringes of that, so they're not fringes anymore, actually. And I look at it this way. There are, at one end of the spectrum, community and local values, and facilitating people to help themselves, so that it's their values that are contributing to planning and design, not the consultants. And I love working at that end of the spectrum and putting their thoughts to work and showing them how things can be better by using landscape architectural skills and so on, but their values and their judgments of things. And yes, you can influence them in that process, but that's not the objective. It's not to get them to think the way you do. It's the other way around. There's the other end of the spectrum too, and it's much more what I would call systems-oriented thinking. And it says, how are we delivering? I'll give you an example because this is something I worked on recently. How are we delivering provincial parks to the people in Ontario? What organization is there to do that? How can it be improved? And we're not even talking about a plan for a particular park anymore, or even master plans for all of the parks. We're talking about an organization that needs to change to deal with all kinds of trends and partnerships and cooperative efforts and new ways of getting things done. And is a branch buried within the Ministry of Natural Resources, for example, the best way of getting that done? So when I work in that end, I'm dealing with usually senior decision makers, and I'm working with no longer design professionals. I'm not working with architects and engineers. I'm working with organizational design specialists, management consultants, and people like that. And I'm there because I know something about provincial parks and values and natural resources and all these things that should get embedded in whatever the new organization is and how it deals with people. So when I look at what I do, I would say, I think it would be nice if the whole profession did more of this, that you take your core work and early in your professional life, you're probably putting 80-90% of your time into what we'd call project design. And it's wonderful. You're doing a park one day, and you're doing a waterfront the next, and a marina the next, and an insurance building the next, and a college campus the next. I mean, everything is new and different. But after a while, you've done 10 marinas, 20 parks, 10 insurance buildings, etc. And it's not that it's boring, it's that you have more to give, I think, than that. So you start pressing the edges and start looking for a new kind of client or a new way of doing things. And that's what's exciting about this profession to me now. And I want people to know I'm a landscape architect when it's all over, but I don't necessarily care if they know before it starts. I think it helps the profession the most when you do something well and then they discover you're a landscape architect, than going in up front saying, because I'm a landscape architect, I know how to get community values. Who's going to believe that or care? So, or because I'm a landscape architect, I think this is how you should reorganize a government agency. That's absurd. So do it and then be recognized for what your profession is, later.
And where do you see that, the kind of work you're doing, and say a lot of other landscape architects could do that, where do you see that will then place you?
Two things will happen. The grassroots end of things, which I described first, means so many people are going to know about our profession who simply live on the land and may become clients someday, or may start pestering others to start listening to what landscape architects have to say. Because this person came into our community and said, I'm giving you a choice. You can tell me what you think your values are, and if you don't volunteer, I mean, it was really blackmail, then I'm going to tell you what I think your values are. Well, so you win over, I think, people to an understanding of how they can participate in planning and design process. And the fact that that's being introduced to them and they're by a landscape architect can only help, I think, support for the profession where ultimately it counts the most. And that's sort of the masses. The other end is important because you still have to deal with decision makers. And if you can show that there's a better way of doing something, the impact of that at that level may be far more important in terms of what I've accomplished than Frontenac Provincial Park Master Plan. That was important then, and I would love to do another one, but I think if I could have the whole organizational structure of provincial parks changed, then I'm going to have a far more impact and value. I don't mean personal impact. I mean, the park system will be better. And if the whole park system is better, isn't that a greater achievement than one park having a nice plan? So I've just picked on parks. What about housing? What about education? I mean, there's so many things in society that when you take that point of view, it's no longer sort of object-oriented. I'm using computer language now, but it's not object-oriented like marinas and housing developments and so on. It's land policy and a much broader kind of decision. Now, there's something that's kind of uniquely Canadian too. We're really great at policy. Americans look to Canadians for new policy initiatives and directions and thinking like that. They really do. I hear it when I go to ASLA meetings and I hear some government person stand up and he said, now in Canada, they're doing these kinds of things. He's wrong. We're not doing it. We sure are writing about
it. The policy's in place. Yeah.
And they admire the kind of thinking that goes into something like a provincial park system that sets out objectives, clear objectives, and there are economic, there's environmental, there's heritage appreciation. We have an orderly way of thinking as Canadians, I think, that is a little more plodding sometimes and a little more deductive. And then you go to the U.S. and you just see something absolutely awful. But then you drive one more mile and you see something absolutely incredible. And the whole thing has a certain energy and life to it that's lacking up here. And here we are so consumed by avoiding the big mistakes that we never have the big successes. And I think that's how I characterize them.
It's taking chances.
We don't take chances.
There's a tremendous British heritage here.
Yeah, we foster mediocrity, I think. And that's what the design professions are constantly up against. It's so easy to do what's been done before. And all our regulatory efforts like zoning, bylaws, and official plans, and all those things, if you read these things, they're almost all geared to preventing the specter of the worst things happening. They're never couched in language that says, if you do something better, you're going to get a bonus from, it's always stopping stuff. And that's, I think, really unfortunate. But I think it's part of that culture. Yeah.
Do you feel that the directions that you would like the profession to go, is that being echoed or mirrored in the schools of landscape architecture currently?
No, I can't. I've not gone back.
Or the ones you know.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think there's still a lot of traditional thinking that's rapidly getting out of date. Yeah.
And do you feel that until those changes take place at an educational level, then the progress of the profession will be stymied?
Well, no, I in my own case, I can't blame the education I got for any mistakes I've made, and I don't think I can credit it for any really pioneering things I've tried. It gave me the foundation to make my own way, and to that I'm eternally grateful. It was a good education. But I think this profession is going to be all of the Jim Stansburys and what they choose to do with it, collectively. And I would not want everyone to be like me, or I think the profession would be greatly limited and doomed. But I want everybody to break loose a bit from what others tell them landscape architecture should be, or teach them. This is my criticism right now. Teach them what landscape architecture should be, because I think it's rather limited. It was very defining, confining.
Do you think though that maybe even in a university situation one can't do that? That it does need to be limiting and defining, and that it is only by having gone out and practiced for 25 years that you can then expand the edges of that envelope?
Well, you might be right, but if I can give you my model for a university, I do it this way. I'm a landscape architect, and I like teaching landscape architecture. I think it's a enormous waste of my time teaching landscape architects about landscape architecture. So if I could go back to a university and do what I really wanted to do, I would want to be in a sort of an institute of some sort that was multidisciplinary and that brought together, let's say, an environmental lawyer, coastal engineer, urban design, architecture, me, social sciences, all the environmental sciences, put them all in one place and have them service the campus. And say, we have this body of talent, and it's experienced talent. These people have not been teaching all their lives. They've been doing things, and they've been teaching too, but they're practitioners, and they have a body of knowledge. And if you are a school of landscape architecture, fine. You go out and you draw on them. If you're a school of rural and or regional and urban planning, you can draw on them. If you're a school of law, you can draw on them. And that faculty would be having an influence over maybe 50, 60% of the students on that campus, not just 4% that happen to be enrolled in landscape architecture. I'm increasingly dissatisfied with trying to influence young landscape architects to be a better landscape architect. I think it's important to do that, and I do it. But I would much rather walk into a classroom filled with, I don't know, you can name anything, and maybe have a lawyer with me who's also wanting to talk about environmental law or something like that. And the two of us do something together as a seminar, and then we walk away. And we really raised consciousness. So when I think of Canadian, or for that matter, American schools, I don't think in terms of visiting a landscape architecture program somewhere. It's not enough. And I guess that's sort of what I'm saying about how I try to practice. It's not enough to design projects anymore. You have to influence and change values and understand other people's values if you're going to really have some success.
And that's what where the profession can certainly go, isn't it?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to apologize to anybody. It just has to do it. It doesn't have to wait to be invited to the party.
And I'm getting a sense too from what you're saying that there are so many fields that these whole concepts could be part of. That there could be this great kind of fingering out effect.
Yeah.
Lots of other areas.
And it is also a reason to, I think, at least pause before jumping on the, quote, environmental bandwagon, in the sense of being another interest group that is indistinguishable to the public from the Wildlands League or the Sierra Club. We do have something more to offer than a point of view about preservation or protection of the resources. And I would think we'd be better off working with the public in some of the ways I've described, and working with other professionals and disciplines and so on, and influencing government policy, helping to write some of it, actually, than being on a soapbox all the time, trying to be perceived as being the same thing as an ecologist, or a population specialist who predicts dooms with what's happening in population growth in places like Mexico. I think there's a real danger in that. That would confuse the public, because we have to do things, not just give speeches.
But do you think landscape architects do give speeches? Do you think
Not
that
enough.
you have
Not
any
really
kind of
enough.
public profile?
No, I suppose that would be better than none at all.
Mhm.